Morning, everyone. My name is Pankaj Kopade, and I'll be talking about citizen science, biodiversity informatics, and environmental education in today's lecture series. Uh, yeah, thank you. Mhm. Yeah, yeah. Thanks a lot, Hardik, for the introduction, the brief introduction. It's a privilege to talk here, and I'm really sure that this talk will be heard and seen by many people who are really interested in nature education and want to see whether their child or the students they may get interested into the nature education, environmental education, or any of the disciplines related to the environmental education, because I think that is something that is very crucial. It's just that we don't talk about it, and the whole perspective of looking at the world is quite changing. The pandemic has taught many things to us, so I guess people will be more cautious when they think about nature in the coming few years. So let me introduce myself again. I keep this slide ready. So I'm an ecologist. I'm an evolutionary ecologist, and I primarily work on owls and dragonflies. And I have my lab group called Chaturullu Lab. That's because I work on dragonflies and owls. So Chatur is for dragonflies and Ullu is for owls. And in my lab group, there are people from varied backgrounds: biogeography, diversity distribution, urban ecology, biodiversity informatics, and conservation outreach. And it's a small, tiny group, but people are really motivated to work towards a sustainable future. I'm also an admin of various citizen science groups, as Hardik mentioned. So one of them is the Dragonfly South Asia group, which is one of the largest group on the dragonflies. And I'm also managing other groups such as Owl India, Roadkill Network, and Pune Bird Atlas. I'm also a Marathi writer. I'm a published writer. I have a book on my name, and that's about literary essays, or it's a literature basically. So you can see some pictures of the species I work on, owls and dragonflies, and the landscapes that I work in, and a part of a subset of my group sitting for a group picture here after a days of field work. So I'll be showing you more and more pictures. So this talk is going to be more interactive, and I would like if everyone contributes to the talk and contributes to the interaction, so that we can it will basically be more interesting for whoever is watching this talk. So let me tell you a few stories about my background and how everything basically comes together. About this particular thing, recently I've been thinking a lot. I'm looking back at my history, and looking at academic history, and trying to connect the dots. So perhaps you can help me here. So here is a picture of the endangered forest owlet. This is the species of owl on which I worked for many years for my PhD. And this is one of the first picture that I took of this particular species. I spent many hours watching this particular bird. It was sitting on a teak tree, and it was around 25, 30 meters away from me. And I was just sitting beneath, under the tree, and I was just watching the owl. The owl was watching me. So it was, just a mutual respect, I think, that we had. So I kept the safe distance and took this picture. But this owl haunted me for the next 5 years for my PhD. And there are so many peculiar things about this particular species that we still don't know. I mean, from a researcher's point of view, we did the studies and we came out with some results. And then we say that, okay, we now know a little bit more about this species. But I guess there are many mysteries and many complexities when you talk about the nature and the elements in the nature. For instance, this owl. And we being also a part of the nature, humans are an animal. We being a part of the nature, we try to decode all these mysteries. And after a point, perhaps there is no more explanation. Or after a point, it just becomes that we don't really gather so much of information that we can really talk about the changing environment, the climate change, and so on. So a collaborative effort is somewhere needed, and that is what I'm going to talk about in the next few slides. So this is a picture just to show you that this is the species I have worked with. And when I started working on this species, I had to visit various forests in the central India. Okay, sure. So the forest owlet, it's one of the most mysterious owl in the world. And this is a species endemic to India. So it's only found in some parts of India, especially the central India and the northern Western Ghats. So starting from Gujarat, Maharashtra, and Madhya Pradesh, these three states, in these three states, we have forest owlet. Their populations are very small and they are highly fragmented population. So it's very difficult to spot the forest owlet in the forest because their populations are very small. This species was discovered in 1872 by a British ornithologist, and he named it forest owlet because it occurs in the forest. And after 1872 till 1878, there were records of the forest owlet. People, spotted the forest owlet in many places. And at that time, the photography technique was not that developed. So people used to, shoot the bird, and that's how they used to identify. So up till 1878, there were records. But after 1878, there were no records of the bird. I mean, people either did not spot it or they did not really find out about forest owlet. And there was a huge gap when ornithologists did not really report the species. Then people started thinking that the forest owlet has gone extinct. It will never be recovered from its native sites. But again, in 1997, after 113 years of gap, an American ornithologist found the forest owlet in Maharashtra, in a place called Toranmal. Many of you might have heard of it. This is in Nandurbar district. And after that, there were many records which were recovered, and people started working on it. So a bird which was supposed to be extinct basically got resurrected by the ornithologist, and then people started really working more about it and trying to understand what is it that is making this species highly restricted and why it is so narrowly distributed and so on. So from various perspectives you can look at this question. I look at this question from an evolutionary biology perspective, and I think that whatever happens, whatever patterns that you see in nature, they have a evolutionary story attached to it, apart from the ecological story that many people try to uncover. So I looked at genetics of the species and looked at how it has diversified, and when was the time, like how many million years back it might have originated and so on. So that is a part of my PhD where I worked on the evolutionary biology of the species. From that particular the whole study, we have got a lot of knowledge which we are using now for the better conservation of the species. So I'll tell some of those stories as we go ahead, and then I'll also talk about another interesting taxa that I work on. So this is typically how we used to work. This is some snapshot just to give you an idea of what kind of work I did as a researcher when I was doing my PhD. So the forest owlet is a dry deciduous forest species, and this is how the dry deciduous forest looks like in the summer months. So there are no leaves, so you are completely in an open forest as such, and the forest looks dead, but it comes alive when you hear a forest owlet, or at night when you hear so many owls calling. So there are so many things which are hidden in this apparently lifeless forest. It's just that you need to have the ears and eyes to observe them. So this is my field car, and we are doing a call playback survey in this area. So I just get this feeling of excitement when I see a forest like this, and that's why I had taken this picture. When we are doing field work, we encounter various types of landscapes. Some of them are, you can see that all of these landscapes are dry landscapes. So in the first picture, there is a grassland which is all completely yellow. And the second picture, there is again a leafless forest. And I'm trying to locate a bird. In these two pictures, where in one of the pictures, you will find me dancing with the tribal people. So these are the tribal people from Shahada, from Toranmar. And during Holi season, the Holi festival, they gather together, and they have this huge wheel-like thing on there. They decorate and they put it on their head, and then they make a group and they stand in the road, and whichever vehicle comes, they ask for for the contribution, the donation for celebrating their festivals. So I took some time and also danced with them. So it was an amazing experience. And in the last picture, you will see that I am working with my team, and I have a big map which I have sort of sprayed on the bonnet of the car. And I have a GPS machine in my hand, and I'm trying to locate where I am, because most of the area that we work in, these are remote places where you don't get mobile network or internet network. And we work with very basic instruments like a compass or a GPS. And we track our ways inside the forest, and then eventually go to the destination. So this whole thing is a really exciting thing. This is the life of a wildlife biologist as such, and this is how it looks like. But since I work on two disciplines, ecology and evolution, my work is not limited to the field work or the field part of the ecology. I also do a lot of lab work, and lab work definitely gives a lot of information. So let me take you to from the field to the lab, and also show you what kind of work we conduct. But these are some more pictures of the field work. So I'll tell you how we detect the owls. Okay, it's very difficult to detect the owls because they're highly camouflagic. You can see their colors, they blend with the trees. So it's very difficult to spot them. So what we do is we use a call playback method. So we have some recorded calls of the owls, which we go to a certain location and we play that call. So you can see I'm holding a white colored speaker in my hand, and I'm emitting the call of the forest owlet. Okay. So if the owl is around, then it responds back to this call. And then I'll need to locate that call, and I'll need to go and scan the trees using a binocular so that I can locate the species. And now this third picture is not this forest owlet, it is a jungle owlet, it is another species. So there are multiple species of owls. There are around 40 species of owls which occur in India. And I worked on 4 different species of owls, which are all small sized owls like these. These are called owlets because they are very small. So they are like 20 to 23 centimeter long owls. And the forest owlet is also an owlet. It's a small sized owl. So similarly, there is another species called jungle owlet, which is this. And once we know that the owl is there, then we go and do the next bit of capturing the owl. Okay. So here is that next bit of capturing the owl. So what we do is we set up mist nets. These are all the mist nets that you can see. And there is, you can see this black colored pole here. And there are people who are setting up the mist nets. These mist nets are basically nylon nets, and these are very, the nylon thread is very fine. So from a distance, you can't see them. Okay. And when the birds fly from one place to another, they get trapped in these nets. And once they get trapped, then we release them from the nets, and then we put them in cloth bags. So you can see a cloth bag here, or the cloth bag here. So we put them in the cloth bag. We tie them up, and then we take them to the mini lab that we have set up on the field. So this is our mini lab where 2 researchers are sitting, and there is a desk here, a mini desk, and it's a portable thing basically. So we have samples. So these are our samples, the species of birds that we are going to study. And we take out their blood sample using a syringe, and then we take their measurements using vernier caliper and so on. And then eventually we will release them back in the wild. So this is the kind of the lab work that is happening in the field. So here is a jungle owlet that we have captured. And this is, the person is holding the jungle owlet by the legs. So this is called a birder's grip. I'm also holding the bird by the leg. So this is called a birder's grip. So this is it's a technique how to hold the bird so that the bird is comfortable and not feeling stressed. So that's how you hold it. And also the bird is not going to it's not going to bite you. Okay. So this is the birder's grip, and this is how you do it. So after we hold the bird, then we first take the measurement. So you can see the vernier caliper here. So using the vernier caliper, we take multiple measurements as that of the beak size and beak width, and then head size and the wing size and so on. And then we fit the bird with a ring. So these are aluminum rings, and each ring will have a code written on it. So why do we do it? Because in the next batch of sampling, if the same bird gets caught, then we have already got the blood sample of the bird. So we don't want that bird to get harassed again and again. So to recognize the birds which are already sampled, we put a ring on the leg of the bird, and we release the bird. So if the next time the same bird gets captured in the net, then we release it immediately. We don't really deal with that bird. And once all those things are done, then we take the blood sample. So we put up basically a simple, it's like a diabetes testing. So we just prick the vein in the wing because that's the strongest vein that birds have. And we take some blood, and then we store the blood in a particular buffer, and that we transport back to the lab, the real original lab where we process the blood for the genetics. Okay. So while we capture birds like owls, we also encounter many birds which we do not really want. So for instance, the flower peckers or warblers or nuthatches, and some of them are really beautifully colored birds. But at the same time, they're also fragile. They are very small birds, so we don't really engage with them. We simply take them out of the net and release them. But you see that doing field work is really exciting, and it is one of the most rewarding experiences that that I always cherish. Okay, so once the blood sample is with us, we come back to the lab, and this is typically how a molecular biology lab looks like. And we do the routine things like PCRs and some reactions we set up, and we basically get the genetic information. And the most important thing of any lab work is the filter coffee, because lab work is like a continuous process, and you get tired many times doing the same thing again and again. So always a shot of coffee helps. So that's how the lab work we conduct. So you see that I started looking for owls. I captured them, then I took their blood, and then I moved it to the lab, and then I did the lab work. And from this, I got some information about their genes, which I compared with many other species, and then I came up with sort of a history of the owls, and which basically gave me an idea about their divergence time and so on. So this is one bit of my PhD. So this is one chapter of my PhD work, basically. But I'm not going to go into details of the nitty-gritties of these whole technicalities. I'll just tell you the small bits of the story, and then at the end, I'll connect all these stories. Okay, so this was just to show you that the kind of work we do is not very mundane, and it's not very boring work. It's quite exciting, because field work is, every time it's challenging work, because we work in remote areas. Many times we work with communities with whom we have never interacted with, and people, complete strangers. So there are many difficulties in the field work. Logistics, logistically there are difficulties. There is not many in remote areas. You don't really get, the luxurious kind of accommodation, or the kind of lifestyle you would want. But there are many rewarding points. So people do field work because they feel happy when they are in the nature, and they feel highly motivated and energetic when they are looking for certain species, or looking at plants, and when they are away from their homes, away from their comfort zones, but they are still happy. Okay, and that's why people pursue wildlife biology, or ecology as such. And of course, the rewarding, there are many rewards when you work with nature and the systems that are natural. But when you come to the lab work, then the science part basically comes in picture. And people like me and few others who are equally interested in connecting the dots with the scientific knowledge, we basically do many analysis on the data that we collect, and then come up with relevant outputs. Okay, so this is a bit of a part of the story that I told you about the owl. Now let me move on to the next taxa, that is the dragonflies and damselflies. And since 2009, I am working on odonets on various topics, mainly to deal with the ecology part of it. So over the years, I basically first learned the dragonfly taxonomy, and it took me a lot of time, because when we started, there was little information available on how to do effective taxonomy. So dragonflies and damselflies are these small, tiny insects, and they come in various shapes and sizes, and there are so many colors out there. And the most fascinating thing is that they are related to water, the fresh water. Okay, so if you have an inclination towards streams and rivers, then I think you will find dragonflies more exciting insect group to work on. And also the fact is that they are just beautiful. I mean, the way they fly, the way they perch, the way they hunt, there are all these things which make them really fascinating insects. And I think that is why I fell in love with dragonflies And I have seen people falling in love with all the glamorous species such as butterflies or tigers or leopards and so on. But I don't know. I mean, I never felt a fascination um, about them. It's just that there are some peculiar things that you will find as you learn more about dragonflies. Okay, so let me go back a little bit and tell you about my life history, how I chose this career, and what were the turning points. So, in a small village, and that's the name of the village is Pofri. It's in the district of Ratnagiri in the Konkan area. And I think my fascination towards nature began there because I was in a village which was full of moist deciduous forest and full of species and so on. And as a kid, when I was in standard eighth, I attended a nature camp which happened in Sangameshwar Tehsil of Ratnagiri district. And at that time, I was introduced to birds. And we also had a chapter on Dr. Salim Ali's life called The Fall of a Sparrow. And that I think that's his also biography, which I have read. So that particular chapter, I think, was a trigger point for me to get fascinated with the world of the birds. And later on, when I attended the nature camp, that really triggered my fascination towards the bird as such. So after that camp, I started looking for birds in the vicinity, in the neighborhood. And at the end of this lecture, I'll show you how my small village looks like. I just want to keep it a mystery. So I'll tell you, after my school education, during the junior college, 11th and 12th, I was in Nashik, okay? And I was in a college called RYK College, RYK Science College. Maybe many of you know about this college. The good thing about our college was that attendance was not compulsory. So we spent a lot of time outside the college. And I was in this private coaching class called the Learning Center. And there was this Professor Acharya who was our biology teacher. And his approach towards teaching was very different than any traditional teachers. He always used to emphasize more on experiments and experiential learning. So although he had this very small room in which he used to conduct the biology classes, that room was full of energy. There used to be so many things to do when you enter that room. So apart from theoretical knowledge that he gave us, he also taught us how to look at life practically, and what all things are possible even when the instruments are not available. How you can conduct experiments by yourself, how you understand biology by yourselves. He's a master's in zoology and has done MEd, and I think he has more than 30 years of experience of teaching, and his way of teaching is really, really innovative. So I think that was that particular private coaching class was the main trigger for me to pursue a career in biological sciences. So I spent just 2 years in his private coaching class, and then I had this huge, sort of a black box where I did not really know what to do with my career. I was really confused about education choice because at that time, in fact, when I completed my 12th, we had many career options available. For instance, there was engineering, there was medical, and there was engineering again, and then medical, and so on. So it was quite, a default pathway that we were supposed to follow. And of course, I got an admission in a BAMS college. This was Poddar College from Mumbai. It's a reputed college. And I was very happy that I'm getting a BAMS admission. So I got the admission, and we started discussing about the career after, BAMS, and then eventually figured that there is no assurity of the career, first thing. Secondly, if you want to start your own, then you need to have some backup. You need to invest money to start your clinic and stuff like that. So we thought that, okay, maybe not BMS. Let's do engineering, because I got admission to a engineering college as well. So that was my second choice. So then I took admission to took admission to an engineering college. I was going to be a production engineer, and the institute was Vishwakarma Institute of Technology, VIT, in Pune. That's again another reputed institute. So I took admission to engineering and I started my engineering. And for 1 month, I was, in an engineering college. And I really got bored of that. I mean, that was not my cup of tea. But it's just that I got admission and I was going to become an engineer who will, earn bucks after completing the education. I thought that it will be a good choice. So while after the month, I got a call from University of Pune saying that my name was on a waiting list in one of the courses that I had given the entrance exam for. And this was Institute of Bioinformatics and Biotechnology. And I was on a waiting list, and some people from the merit list, they basically took admission somewhere else. So my number came into the merit list, and the administrator had called me. So when they called, then I told them, yes, I'm going to take admission in this course, because this is something what I was looking for. This is a MSc course, MSc in biotechnology course. And I had thought that that is the most relevant course for the kind of interest that I have. Okay. And believe me, I was more fascinated by the idea of genetic engineering. And I always thought that if I become a biotechnologist by the end of my master's, maybe I will be doing cloning and all sorts of genetic engineering, all the fancy stuff. So I took the admission in this department. I withdrew my admission from the VIT college, and I started learning in IBB. So I spent 5 years in IBB. It was really a huge academic time, where I learned a lot about biological systems and microbiology and many other things. And by the end of my master's, I realized that whatever I have learned is highly industry oriented, or highly oriented towards applied sciences. And my inclination is actually in the basic sciences. I'm not really fascinated by the technology part of it, but I'm more interested in understanding how the world works. And that's where was another switch that happened. And I thought that it looks like I should not go ahead with the MTech course, and should simply, after completing my master's, maybe perhaps look for alternative options, which I think I'll be doing good. So one such option was ecology, definitely, because I always had inclination towards nature and birds. And I thought that perhaps my expertise can be used better if I, go for the appropriate branch of science. So after completing my MSc in biotechnology, I again switched my, career completely. And I went on to Eagle Nest Wildlife Sanctuary to, get some research experience in the field of ecology. So for this time, I worked with another prominent ecologist called Dr. Ramana Atreya. He is a faculty with ICER Pune. So I worked with him for some time, and he has this one project going on from many years in the Arunachal Pradesh in Eagle Nest Wildlife Sanctuary. So I spent some days there, and Northeast is just fabulous when it comes to biodiversity. And I think if you are thinking about Western Ghats, then Kerala, and if you are thinking about Northeast, then Arunachal Pradesh, these are the two hot states if you really want to learn biodiversity. So I was in one of the hot zones of the biodiversity, and I learned a lot, many things when I was interning with Dr. Ramana Atreya. So after that small stint, I went on to do a job with an institute called Salim Ali Center for Ornithology and Natural History. And this was in the end of 2010, after I had completed my master's. And my posting was in Andamans. So I got really lucky that I got to work in the most exotic places of India, where you can expect a huge, amounts of biodiversity. I worked there for more than, I guess, 6 months, and after that, the project was over. So I came back to Pune, and then after that job, I went into another job that was a ISRO funded project. This was Indian Space Research Organization's project, where they were interested in mapping the biodiversity of Western Ghats, parts of the Western Ghats, which is Koina and Chanduri, Koina Wildlife Sanctuary and Chanduri National Park. So I worked in that project for 2 years, 2011 to 13. And in these 2 years, I learned many ecological tools and techniques, and also tried to understand, the whole various ecosystems, whichever I studied. And I got many opportunities to learn, about these techniques myself. And I think in a job, if you're learning, then I think that's a good job for you. So I really enjoyed this work thoroughly. And after 2013, I basically went on to do a PhD. And then after completing my PhD, I have become a faculty now. And I'm guiding more than 15 students now, right now, mentoring many research students. So it's been a wonderful journey for me. And I think that's all because I, made a conscious switch in my career and education. And all those switches, I guess, really paid me off. Okay. So now that was a bit of the really long story, but let me take you to the world of the dragonflies. Let's talk a little bit about dragonflies, and then go on and try to understand what is this citizen science and biodiversity informatics that I'm going to talk on. So let me just introduce you with the system, and then perhaps if you get fascinated more, then perhaps you'll understand the value of citizen science, more. So just a minute, let me have some water. Yeah, sure. In fact, I was going to suggest that if you have any questions, you can send them in the chat box so that later on we can revisit. Okay. So dragonflies are one of the most fascinating insects, and that's because there are many aspects in which they stand apart. So first thing is the evolution. They evolved around 325 million years back, and this is one of the ancient fossils. And this is not a small rock. It's a huge rock on which you see an imprint of the dragonfly body and the wings. So in fact, the ancient dragonflies around 325 million years ago, they were huge in size. So if you compare ancient dragonflies with a human, this is how the comparison would look like. And the modern dragonflies, we know that they are very small, tiny, and you can catch them by your hands. So these are one of the insect radiations which took the flight in the ancient times. And these are also one of the insects. Sorry? Share the screen again. Okay. Okay, just give me a minute. Let me. Okay, is it visible now? Sorry. Yeah. So, so I was talking about odonets, and they are ancient insects evolved around 325 million years ago. And if you compare the ancient insects with the human, then this is how the comparison will look like. The modern insects are very tiny, and the change from the bigger size to the smaller size has happened because of changes that has happened in the oxygen level. And basically the insects got adapted and evolved to match the oxygen levels in the air, and they become smaller and smaller. So in fact, the ancient insects would look something like this. They are huge, and I mean, no doubt, if they sit on your head, they can chew off your brain. So they would have been so much strong at that time. So these insects come from a Permian period or the Carboniferous era. So these are how the ancient insects would have looked like. And this is the depiction of the Carboniferous era around 350 million years back. So in the sky, you wouldn't see any birds because they were not evolved at that time. Birds are much younger evolutionary radiation, and the dragonflies were only the big things in the sky at that time. Eventually, the oxygen levels dropped, and the dragonflies becomes smaller and smaller. Many other taxa they evolved. For example, dinosaurs and later on birds, reptiles and birds, and so on. But imagine if you were living in the Carboniferous era, around 350 million years back, and if you had a house, let's say, in this swampy region. So if you hear a knock knock on your door and open the door, perhaps a dragonfly may just fly in, and this is how it will look like. So it's a very interesting thing, to talk about the evolution of the dragonflies. They have been so big, and now they are so tiny. So if you look at the tiniest one, today they come in so many different shapes and sizes and colors. And the colors are very vibrant. It's not that they are drab colored or dull colored insects. They are winged insects with so many beautiful colors. And if you start looking, at them at wetlands, then you'll realize that there is tremendous variety in the, overall in the dragonflies and damselflies. These insects, as opposed to the butterflies, they are voracious predators. So that is, I think, one of the unique properties of the dragonflies. So although they look very beautiful in different colors, they don't really feed on plants, sap or flower nectar or anything like that. They are completely non-vegetarian and carnivorous, and they are top predators in any ecosystem, in any insect ecosystem. So they can take prey as large as their size. In this picture, you can see that, or sometimes even bigger. So here is a damselfly feeding on a small insect, and here these two are pictures of the dragonflies. They are feeding on other species of dragonflies. So they are voracious predators. Even in their larval forms, they are predators, and also in the adult form, they always remain predators. Their flights are superb. I mean, they can move in all the directions. The best thing is they can take a reverse. They can go back in the air. A quality which is an ability which is not there in many insect groups, because multiple insect groups have something called halters. So these halters are basically tiny appendages behind their hind wings here, which oppose the backward motion. But in case of dragonflies, those halters don't exist. And that's why the dragonflies can move forward as well as reverse. Okay. The dragonflies, they have 4 wings, 2 forewings and 2 hind wings. And all the wings, they are attached to the thorax, which is this central part of the body. And each wing has a separate set of muscles. So each wing can beat separately, synchronously, asynchronously. And that a lot of flexibility in terms of swift flights and taking turns very fast and so on. So they have become really a marvel when it comes to aerodynamics and flight. So many physicists are actually studying the flight patterns of the dragonflies and trying to understand if you want to make a highly flexible flying machine, then the dragonflies is an inspiration to look for. Their dragonflies also show a lot of territoriality. So males, they will be guarding small patches of territory, and whenever another males come into that part, they will start fighting. But their fights do not include biting and beating. They simply show off their colors. So they fly together in front of each other. So both of them are males. Here also both of them are males. These are damselflies actually. So they fly, against each other, face each other, and they exhibit their wing colors and their body coloration. So if if one of the males is brightly colored and can exhibit these dancing moves um, for a longer duration, then that male basically wins that territory. Other male has to retreat. So it's a very nice a sort of a dance that you can see if you go to a pond side or a lake side. So this is territoriality, and for them it's a very aggressive gesture. But perhaps for us it is simply a dance that you can enjoy sitting at a river shore. The dragonflies, they also exhibit a very interesting life cycle. Half of their life is underwater and half of it is above the water in the air. So the dragonfly female lays eggs underwater. From the egg, a larva develops, and the larva becomes a voracious predator underwater. So these larvae, they can eat another larvae, another insects or small fishes, tadpoles, and so on. So underwater, they are completely again, predators, and they grow in size after eating a lot of proteinaceous food. They grow in size, and after a point, they come out of the water and they climb up on a stick, and from here they emerge out as a dragonfly. So the dragonflies has got a wing, and the dragonflies are highly aerial in nature. So they do not frequently come down to the ground, or do not very frequently come to the ground for feeding. They mostly feed on the aerial insects. So of course they come back to the ponds whenever they have to mate, and whenever they have to guard the territories, but mostly they feed on the aerial insects. So even their reproduction is very quite interesting. So when they reproduce, they create a wheel-like structure, and many times it is referred as a heart wheel shape structure. And perhaps the inspiration of heart might have come from this. We don't know, but this is typically how the reproduction happens. So the upper one is a male, and the lower one is a female. So the male has got two different genitalia. One primary genitalia, which is over here on the last segment of the abdomen, and the secondary genitalia, which is on the second segment of the abdomen here. Whereas the female has got only one genitalia, that is primary genitalia, which is at the end of her abdomen. So it's a very complex or acrobatic, position of reproduction, and this has evolved over a period of time. So I mean, there are so many peculiar things about dragonflies which you don't see in another insects. Now this is it's a baby dragonfly. It's a larva of a dragonfly, and this is how they look like. They will be always underwater, and they have got very sharp, mouth parts by which they can pick up any prey, and then they can eat it. This is how a damselfly baby looks like, or a damselfly larva looks like, and they have got a very different, size and shape as compared to the dragonfly larvae, and they have got this sort of a tapering tail. And some structures for these structures basically help them to breathe underwater. There are even more peculiar things about dragonflies. For example, migration. So some species migrate locally, some species migrate from one place to from a longer distance. We know of wandering glider Pantala flavescens to Africa and then comes back to India. And this happens every year. It's an annual cycle. So the wandering gliders, these are yellow, orangish colored dragonflies, which you often see in the skies just before the monsoon. So you will see flocks of dragonflies in the sky. So these are the pantalas that you see, and they are flocking because with a flock they can migrate easily, because with a flock their predation percentage or predation probability basically decreases, and they migrate from India to Africa. And this particular discovery of migration has a very interesting story. So there is this marine biologist called Charles Anderson, and this person stays on Maldives, and he studies marine biology over here. So he used to see the pantalas migrating or flocking over Maldives for a particular duration every year. And he got very interested about insects coming to Maldives and then disappearing from the skies. So he thought that perhaps these insects are appearing from the nearby mainland, and the nearby mainland is either India, Sri Lanka, or the Middle East or the Africa. So he contacted people, other researchers from these areas, and then he tried to track the appearance and disappearance of pantalas in the sky. And over the period of 14 years, 14 long years, he basically kept meticulous notes of when the pantalas come and when they go. And then he eventually discovered that there is a migration that happens. So pantalas, they come from India and they fly over the sea. They come to Maldives. From there, again, they fly over to the sea and go to the Africa. And then again, from the other route, they go to India, and then this cycle basically keeps on running. So this is the longest recorded migration in insects, and this is 17,000 kilometers of journey over the sea. And the tiniest of the insects are doing it every year. So this is really fabulous thing. So when it was discovered, people did some genetic study as well as some other chemical studies to understand whether this is really the same population that migrates. But they found out that the species is the same, the populations differ. So there are many generations which are migrating together. It's not a single generation that migrates. There are many generations which are migrating together. So wherever there is land, so species will drop the eggs there at the land, and the dragonflies, adult dragonflies which develop from these eggs, they will also start migrating. So there are many generations which are migrating together, but this is another fabulous thing about dragonflies. So they migrate and they do long distance migration as well as short distance migration. So this is a pair of pantala who is reproducing in the air. So since they fly over the sea and there is hardly any land where they can perch and where they can come back to the land, they do most of the thing in the air only. So now, why suddenly are we concerned about dragonflies and insects and disappearance of the organisms from the planet Earth? So it's because we are facing something called the sixth mass extinction, and many studies have indicated that we have already entered into the sixth mass extinction. So there is very little time available for us, human race, to safeguard our planet and also take up the responsibility of being the most intellectual animal on the planet Earth. So when you look at this infographic, it is self-explanatory. 13% of the birds, they are threatened. 25% of the birds, animals, mammals are threatened, and over 41% of the amphibians are threatened globally. And majority of these threats, they come in the simplistic form, such as habitat degradation, habitat loss, anthropogenic factors, for instance, land use change and urbanization and so on. So the risks are quite visible, and the reasons behind the risk is also clearly crystal clear. They are very crystal clear. In fact, one study by Ceballos et al. In 2016, it pointed out that how the extinction of the animal is linked to the people or the humans. So here is a very simple graph. You can see on the x-axis, you see the date 1500 to 2014. And on the y-axis, it's a roughly, it's basically extinction risk that you can, think of. So there is a dotted line that you see. This is the background rate. So naturally, the extinction rate, grows like this. This is what the background rate is. But starting from 1700, we have picked this extinction rate drastically, almost exponentially, especially for mammals and birds. So their extinction risk has increased quite drastically from 1700 onwards. And if you match these years, then these years were the years of colonization of various lands by humans. And then later on, there was industrial revolution that has happened. So starting from 1700, we have really messed up a lot, and there is a lot of chaos in terms of ecosystems and animal welfare. And we have, I think, not really got the mathematics correct. And now, we are facing the sixth mass extinction. Now, the sixth mass extinction is the mass extinctions in general is the time period when many species globally go extinct in a very short period of time. And we are facing the sixth mass extinction. And every year this assessment comes, how many species are extinct, right? So every year we are adding, more and more number of species to the list of extinct species. And whenever a species goes extinct, all the ecosystem services that particular species provide, they are also extinct. And we basically, lose a large chunk of, financial safety or ecosystem safety as such, which we are not really aware of. So that's the today's reality, and it definitely calls for understanding ecosystems better and doing something for it. So just to give you an example of insects, in the last 25 years, in the protected areas of Germany, around 75% insect abundance has declined. So that's a tremendous decline in the population of the insects. And you can also relate this with the Indian scenario. So earlier when you used to switch on a lamp, so many insects will just, fly to the lamp. But now there is hardly any insect. Or maybe, you can relate to this that, if you're biking or, taking your car out in the outskirts, perhaps 10 years back, your car bonnet would be full of insects, right? But now there are hardly any insects that you see around you. Of course, you see insects like mosquitoes, pests, many pests, but you do not see insects from belonging to other species. So this whole scenario is referred as ecological Armageddon by scientists. And why this is because insects, they are the fundamental layer when it comes to the food pyramid or the energy pyramid. And when you remove that fundamental layer, the whole ecosystem collapses. And then it has many cascading effects. Climate change is nothing but an aggravation of all these effects which are happening globally. So we are directly facing the impacts of climate change, and that's why we are concerned about climate change. But these are the very reasons why the climate change is happening in the first place. So as the insect abundance goes, the reduction in the insect abundance is actually related to the land use change, which is mediated by humans most of the time. And for dragonflies, since they are wetland associated insects, if the wetlands disappear, their presence will not be noticed. I mean, they will go locally extinct. So to understand these processes better and to come up with some conservation strategies, there are multiple ways in which we can do this. The first thing is to do research on core topics which are related to conservation. So with dragonflies, we are doing it. We are visiting remote areas, pristine forests, as well as we are looking at urban ecosystems, because urban ecosystem is where there is a lot of pressure on the ecosystems by humans. And these are the areas where species may go locally extinct very fast as compared to the protected areas like these. So doing the core research as well as engaging people is something that we look for. Many times people ask me that what will happen if the dragonflies go extinct. I mean, we never knew about them, first thing, and it doesn't really matter to us because I'm not really fascinated by dragonfly or a butterfly or any other bird. And yeah, they're there. Perhaps if they disappear, then their songs may disappear. There may not be any melodious sound, but it doesn't really matter because 24 hours I'm playing a game on my smartphone or a computer, and I don't really care about what happens outside my room. That is the kind of attitude I have basically encountered many times when I talk to students who do not really want to sit for a lecture. So, it's a very selfish kind of a reason that you can give. But looking at from a holistic perspective, dragonflies or any other insects, they are, they provide a lot many ecosystem services. So talking about dragonflies, they are predators in the insect ecosystem, and they basically maintain the energy pyramid in an ecosystem. So for that, the person has to first know what is an energy pyramid. Okay, it is an exchange of energy that happens between various strata of animals, starting from plants to insects to small mammals or birds to the top predators. So energy gets exchanged, and the dead material, or the material which is uh, devoid of energy, gets decayed, and it is basically converted into nutrients. And these nutrients are the very nutrients which help the plants to grow. So it's a cycle basically. So disrupting that cycle can definitely harm the productivity of the soil, and that it can create food crisis and so on. So the nutrient cycling is one of the important service that dragonflies provide. They also keep in control the population of many pests. For example, the mosquitoes. So here is a picture of a dragonfly eating a mosquito. Okay, so dragonflies do feed a lot on mosquitoes. When they are larvae underwater, they feed on mosquito larvae, and when they are adults, they feed on adult mosquitoes. So in both their life cycles, both the parts of their life cycles, they are contributing in a way to control the population of mosquitoes. Apart from mosquitoes, they also feed on various insects, which are referred as agricultural pests. For example, locusts. So recently we had a locust invasion, and people called it as locust attack, but it was nothing but a mass migration that happened. And that is again because it was sort of mediated by climate change events. So dragonflies being the top predators, they can control populations of all the harmful insects for humans. Many times they are taken as inspiration for developing new instruments, or engineering marvels like a helicopter on windmills and so on. And they are widely studied for the qualities, or the extraordinary abilities they have. So they are also a matter of research model system, and people are working on dragonflies all over the globe and coming up with newer and newer research. So in fact, one of the technology I would like to share is called Dragonfly Eye, where a live dragonfly is fitted with some chips, and this dragonfly can be operated by an operator using a remote control, and then it works like a tiny drone. Now this tiny drone can do many things. For example, work as a spy camera, or can deliver objects like a usual drone, take aerial pictures and so on. So even apart from the front of caring for the dragonflies, the dragonfly themselves have been used for creating sort of semi robot machines. I mean, I'm not in favor of this particular technology because it just hurts. But yeah, I mean, this is just to show you that people are working on various aspects. So as I mentioned, that they are efficient predators. Many times they also connect two different ecosystems, so they are called as ecosystems connector. Many times small bugs, they simply attach to the dragonfly body, and they get transported from one place to another. So in a way, they also connect various ecosystems. So that is again another ecosystem service that they provide. So we have in the world around 6,500 species of dragonflies, and roughly they are divided into they are basically taxonomically placed into three different suborders: Anisoptera, that is dragonflies, Zygoptera, and Anisozygoptera. So ptera meaning word wings, isos is equal, and unisos is unequal. So if you look at dragonfly, their fore wings and the hind wings, they are not equal in size and shape. That's why they are called as Anisoptera or dragonflies. In Zygoptera, zygos is another word for equal. So Zygoptera meaning all the wings which are equal in size and shape, and that's why when the damselflies sit, they generally close their wings, because all the wings they can go equally on each other, and it looks like they have a single wing, but actually they have four different wings. Whereas Anisozygoptera, this particular suborder has mixed characters of dragonflies as well as damselflies. So you can see their body is robust like a dragonfly, but they can fold their wings. like a damselfly. Okay, so this particular group is it's a relict group. There are only 2 species globally, and both the species occur in Himalayas. So when we talk about peninsular India, or most of the Indian species, we simply talk about dragonflies and damselflies. So interesting thing is that although there are so many species already known from the globe, there are up to 1,000 species which still await description. So there is a prediction that there are more than 1,000 species which we still do not know about anything. So they could be completely new to science. And in fact, newer and newer species are getting discovered from India. This year itself, in the beginning of the year, there was one new species discovery from the Konkan region. So there are new species are getting added every year to the Indian Odonata list. So if you want to figure out what is the difference between a dragonfly and damselfly, so one difference I already told you, that is their wings. So the dragonflies will always sit with their wings open, and the wings are not equal in size, whereas damselflies always sit with their wings closed. Another difference is that the structure of the body. So if you look at the thorax and the abdomen, both these things for a dragonfly, they are very robust. In case of a damselfly, they look very narrow and tapering and fragile. The third difference is their eyes. So the dragonflies, they will have eyes which are touching each other, whereas for the damselflies, their eyes are separated. There is a portion of the head and eyes are separated from each other. You see that there are many small dots in the eyes of the dragonfly, right? So these eyes are compound eyes. Each of the compound eye contains up to 15,000 lenses. So together they make up to 30,000 lenses. And that gives them a really, a great view of the world. And that's why they, also become very highly efficient predators, and they are sort of very fast when they move in the sky. Same thing with damselflies, they have compound eyes, and each eye contains up to 15,000 lenses. So these are some of the fabulous characters about dragonflies and damselflies. So let me show you a video just to, make sure that you attend the remaining lecture and appreciate dragonflies more. So let me know if you are able to see the video and listen to it.
We may think of lions and sharks among the most successful predators in nature, but lions and sharks catch about 50% of their prey at best. Dragonflies, on the other hand, catch up to 95% of their prey. What enables them to do this? Scientists have found from recording signals in the brain that they can focus on one object at a time, picking out their prey from a swarm of other insects. They have separate sets of muscles for 4 different wings. That means they can fly upside down, they can pivot 360 degrees, they can fly backwards, and they can fly 30 miles an hour. And they have among the best eyes of any creature in nature. When a dragonfly is flying at you, it can see you as it's coming toward you and as it's going away.
I can't see your presentation.
Most agile animals.
Okay. Shall I reshare it?
Yes.
Yes,
Yeah,
it's only here. I can't see.
I'm sharing the video, not the presentation now. Are you able to see that?
We are able to hear. We are not able to see.
Okay. Okay. Wait a minute. Let me reshare it. I'm really sorry for that. Shall I reshare the video? Okay. Now can you see it? I'm about to start it.
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
Yes, we can see it now.
Okay, great. I'm starting it now. Okay.
think of lions and sharks among the most successful predators in nature. But lions and sharks catch about 50% of their prey at best. Dragonflies, on the other hand, catch up to 95% of their prey. What enables them to do this? Scientists have found from recording signals in the brain that they can focus on one object at a time, picking out their prey from a swarm of other insects. They have separate sets of muscles for 4 different wings. That means they can fly upside down, they can pivot 360 degrees, they can fly backwards, and they can fly 30 miles an hour. And they have among the best eyes of any creature in nature. When a dragonfly is flying at you, it can see you as it's coming toward you and as it's going away, giving them the chance to escape even the quickest and most agile animals that want to eat them.
So I hope now you will be more fascinated by dragonflies than ever after watching this video. And now you are able to also distinguish between dragonflies and damselflies. Am I correct? Hello? Can I have some answer here? Okay, they're typing. Okay. All right, so let's do a bit of an exercise for everyone and see if you are really now able to distinguish between a dragonfly and damselfly, okay, based on the features which are presented here. So this is a pair of crimson marsh glider, and the male here is a brightly colored species. It's a crimson colored species, and the female is so can you please tell me whether it's a dragonfly or a damselfly? Any response? I'm sorry, I'm not able to see the chat box. So yeah.
It's a dragonfly, right?
It's a dragonfly, yes, correct. It has wings which are open, wings which are not in the same shape and size. The body is robust and the eyes are touching each other, right? So it's a dragonfly. What about this one? Is it a dragonfly or a damselfly?
It's a dragonfly.
Correct. Once again, correct. This is a dragonfly. The wings are open and the body is robust. Eyes are touching each other. So this is a male and that's a female. Males are generally brightly colored than the females. What about this?
By saying the body, we can say it's not a dragonfly. The eyes is not visible here, but there's a gap between the 2 eyes.
Yes.
I'm able to see that. But based upon the body, it's not a dragonfly.
Yeah, correct. So it's a damselfly. As he rightly mentioned that based on the body is fragile and narrow, and the wings are folded.
Yeah, by sitting.
Eyes are not very well visible, but they are separated. So these are another species of a damselfly called Senegal golden dartlet. And you can see that I have given many pictures here, right? So, and I earlier showed you about this mating wheel in which the upper one is the male and the lower one is the female, right? So is there any peculiar thing about this picture?
I'm also observing that. I can't able to understand that one because it's 2 insects, but the tail is going down, the one more is coming up. It's quite.
Okay. So the interesting thing about this particular species is that so this is the male coloration. This is how the male looks like. Okay, and in case of females, there are different colorations. So this is a female which is called as a regular female. This is how typically a female looks like. But there is a variation in the color, and sometimes you get heterochromatic females like this, red in color. There is one more variation in the females, and those females look exactly like males. So this is a female, and this looks exactly like a male. So such a female is called andromorphic female, and there is this tremendous variety of coloration in females. And the andromorphic female is mainly to, this particular phenotype arises because these females want to save themselves. So what happens is that in a wetland system, there are many such males, and males are looking for females to, for copulation and reproduction. So whenever a female comes to their territory, the male will grab them and copulate. So it creates a lot of pressure on the females, and the females will always be engaged in reproduction, and they will not find time for, feeding themselves and so on, and they may simply die of hunger. So the females, they want to escape from the males, and one strategy is that if they resemble males. So many a times you will find the andromorphism, which is basically to regulate reproduction in the species, the Senegal golden dartlet. So it's a very amazing thing again, a new thing that perhaps you might have learned, that dragonflies and damselflies are not just mere insects; they are full of mysteries and stories. Okay, what about this particular species? Is it a dragonfly or a damselfly?
It's not a dragonfly, it's a damselfly.
Correct. It's a damselfly. The body is narrow, the wings are folded, eyes are separate. This is a male, and here is a male which is holding a female, and the female is laying eggs in this aquatic plant. So you can see that the water level is here. So the female is holding the part of the aquatic plant, and she has dipped her abdomen under the water. And now what she is doing is she is boring holes in the aquatic plant, and she will leave eggs inside it, protected, from other predators in the water. And the male is holding her by neck, and this is called a mate guarding behavior, where the male do not want to lose the female, or the male do not want that other male will come and reproduce again. So the male is making sure that the female is laying his eggs. So this is another behavioral story when it comes to this. So now you might be interested a little bit more about dragonflies, and you may want to learn about them, identification, and know how to study them. So there are some resources available. There are some field guides available, and these are freely downloadable. So you can simply put the names in the Google, and you will get a PDF file. So you can download it, and you can see what different variety of dragonflies you see around your house, and that might actually start learning more about them. Yeah. Hello, can you please? Yes. Okay. We also have developed a web resource for everyone that's called Odonata of India. This is a website, indianodonata.org. So if you are interested in web-based resources, then that's also available for many people to study and learn dragonflies. So right now we have a lot of literature available on dragonflies, and over the period of time, many people have contributed greatly. So we have excellent taxonomic literature up to 400 species or so which are available. But we lack a lot of research on ecology and evolution, conservation and outreach, and a good network of researchers is somewhere we are lacking. Okay, so thinking about all these issues, we thought that perhaps citizen science will be a good model to follow, where many people from various disciplines can come together to study dragonflies and become a citizen scientist. So if you think that now you have some interest in dragonflies or in nature in general, and you want to help the research or the conservation of these tiny insects, then you can become a citizen scientist. It's a very simple thing. Okay, what you do is you go out there, you take pictures of dragonflies, and then you post them on a common platform. Now this is real-time data because it's coming directly from the users and coming in real time. And this data eventually will be used for the landscape conservation movements. Because the conservation is not only about one species, it's about ecosystems, it's about ecosystem services that the species provides. So essentially, it's a conservation of function, not the structure or the species. Okay, and a particular landscape is not only about you or only about dragonflies. It's about everyone together. So it's about the cultures, societies, the living organisms, and the ecosystems and services that they are providing, climate, and so on. So it's a complex thing. And if we want to do conservation, then we need to really think from a holistic point of view. Okay. Similar thing happens in education. If you restrict yourself to a particular discipline, then perhaps you become more and more specialized. But then you are also losing the holistic nature of education or holistic nature of science and arts. Okay. And I think that is what exactly I'm going to point towards in the next few slides. So let me tell you about the story of Dragonfly South Asia, the citizen science network that we have created. And in this network, it's not only about people who are doing, who are ecologists or who are researchers. It's a network of people inclusive of all strata of the society, all strata of age groups. So in our network, we have housewives, we have students, we have very old seasoned researchers and so on. So this is a group in which people are together because they have a common interest. It's not about academic qualification or about your achievements in your life, but it's simply about people care about dragonfly, or they simply want to contribute in the nature education and the conservation. So the Dragonfly South Asia is I'll just walk you through the growth of Dragonfly South Asia over the years. So in 2005, we first established as a Yahoo group. This was a mailing list where people used to exchange emails and then talk about dragonflies. And in 2009, we migrated to Facebook because there was sudden increase in the Facebook traffic, and many people, especially the young generation, they have moved to Facebook. So everyone had to sort of move to Facebook. So we moved Dragonfly South Asia to Facebook. In 2011, we started formalizing the group, and we added many admins to the group, and then we created the iNaturalist project. Now, iNaturalist is a citizen science portal on which you can deposit your data. So I'll also talk about that. And in 2014, we started conducting physical meetings of Dragonfly India. So at that time, it was called Dragonfly India. And in these meetings, we started teaching about dragonflies and how to conduct surveys and how conservation can be pursued as an activity which can be done in a community. And since 2014, we are conducting such meeting. In 2017, we got so much of response from even neighboring countries that we had to change the nomenclature of Dragonfly India to Dragonfly South Asia to include many countries which were from where the participants were coming. Okay, so now we have participants from Sri Lanka, Nepal, Bhutan, Myanmar, and Pakistan, Bangladesh, and so on. So it has become a huge community now. In sometime in 2018, I gave a talk on TEDx platform about Dragonfly South Asia and its growth, and it basically got a global platform. And in 2020, because of the lockdown and pandemic, we didn't do a physical meeting, but we did a virtual meeting. So the virtual meeting will keep on happening every year, and I hope that in the next meeting, perhaps some of you can join. And we also thought that there is a big problem because we always speak in English and all these sciences are delivered in English. So we thought that it will be good to create regional literature and perhaps talk in Marathi, Bengali, or Hindi, Kashmiri. So we created this whole idea of DSA regional talks, and we in fact conducted some regional talks, and they were really they got a good response from the people, because those who did not really understand the technical jargon, now with the regional language talks, they could now learn more about dragonflies in their own languages. So that's how we have developed as a community over the period of times. And the Dragonfly South Asia meeting, this is typically how the meeting looks like. This is a very informal setting where we give talks and introduce people with the world of dragonflies. We take them to the field, and then they start exploring. They take pictures, they discuss among themselves, and they also explore many new landscapes, which are many a times wetland areas. And then we also have group discussions to understand what they learned, or how do they perceive the conservation, what should happen in the coming years, and so on. So although our focus is mainly on dragonflies, as Hardik has mentioned, we also look for everything that we see. For example, birds or reptiles, amphibians, and in general try to understand the philosophy of conservation or sharing, the philosophy of sharing, which is, I think, is something that we all need very desperately. And the sharing part is something that is ignored a lot by many people. So today, Dhamapur, yeah. Yeah, sure. So our 2019 meeting happened in the district of Sindhudurga at a place called Dhamapur. It's a village, but it has got a very beautiful lake, Dhamapur Lake, and it's a historical lake. So this is a 400 years old lake, and it was built by Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj, and then later on, it was used by the people. So that is one of the biggest reservoir in that area, villages for various purposes. But recently there was sort of a development that was going to happen apparently, and the villagers from Dhamapur, they thought that Dhamapur Lake is their natural and historical heritage, and they should preserve this through community participation. So when I got in touch with the leader of the organization, he mentioned about the same, and he said that if you conduct a meeting in Dhamapur, it will benefit us a lot, because you guys will be providing us scientific data, and this data together we can use in our petition, and perhaps the court will hear us, and perhaps then the decision will be taken in our favor. So we did the same. We in the meeting we collected a lot of data. So we had a meeting for 3 days, and 3 days of time we collected a lot of data on birds and odonats, and also many other species. We conducted many night trails, and we basically explored that area as much as we could. And we did this in a very sophisticated citizen science framework, where all our participants were first trained, and then we made groups, small groups, and each group was sent into various locations near the lake. So all the data we provided to them, and it's a success story basically. The court considered that data, and they also have conducted many surveys prior to our surveys. So all the data together really helped a lot for making their case stronger, and now all the developmental activities are stopped on the lake. So I guess this is a direct success story of how the conservation happens in reality. So if people come together for a good purpose and collect data together, then I think it. And I think thanks Hardik for just poking me there, and bringing this point here, that conservation is something that it's a participatory activity. One single person cannot do conservation, and if many people join hands together, then yeah, it's possible. So now we are all happy that the Dhamapur Lake is saved, and it's a beautiful area. So if you get time, or if you get any chance, you please visit that lake. It's a beautiful area. There is a small temple of a goddess there, and there is no disturbance over there. I mean, there is no plastic, there is no construction on the lake, construction that has been made, and it's really beautiful. So participation definitely helps in conservation. Yes. So talking about Dragonfly South Asia, we now have around 8,000 members, and these are all managed data record, 13,000 plus data records. Now we are analyzing all these data records with the help of students from computer science background. And I mean, in the next bit of just last remaining few slides, I'll talk about that. So apart from Dragonfly South Asia, it's an informal group. There is no formal registration, nothing like that. It's just that people come together. But we are also supported by various other NGOs and groups. So I'll tell you about the iNaturalist project in brief. So this is a citizen science project on which people deposit data. And so this is a snapshot. This is a bit older snapshot. So you can see there are around observations which are submitted by people. Now, these are the people who may not really have expertise in dragonflies. They are people like you and me, and post it. But then there are experts in the group who identify them, and then you get a record. So you see that there are many places from where we have got records, even from Andaman and Nicobar Islands. So all these records eventually are going to help us in any conservation movement. Okay, so if let's say if you are in an area where there is a lake and people want to perhaps remove the lake and create towers over there. So if you really care about that place and if you think that removing the lake is not the good decision for the environment, then you need some data to claim that, okay, this lake provides shelter to so many species. And from where that data will come? That data will come only through projects like this, where people have already collected data. If the government comes and says that we are going to remove this lake, you show us some data, otherwise we are going to remove this. So at that point, perhaps you will start collecting the data. So perhaps it will be too late, to start collecting the data and show it to the government or whoever the stakeholders are. So it's always good to collect the data and keep it ready with us and, use it whenever there is a crisis that happens. And also to understand the landscape better. Okay, so the government of India has already started People's Biodiversity Register. Now, this is an activity where people registered all the species of all the species that they see around them in a sort of they make a catalog of it, so that of all the natural resources which they can use or which are available in the vicinity of their village. Okay, and this is because India is heading towards a biodiversity mission, and one of the sustainable development goals it deals with life on Earth and life below water. So globally, there is a lot of concern about biodiversity, understanding biodiversity and maintaining and managing it. So in any cases, citizen science always helps because you are already collecting data and you are depositing. And this is a way to connect with the nature. When you take a picture of the dragonfly, you start, appreciating its beauty, you start appreciating the colors in it, the posture and so on. You perhaps will go and study more about dragonflies, perhaps you'll get more insights. And this is a pure, it's a pure enjoyable moment when you discover something yourself, which is very difficult to find in today's world. Okay, we have so many outlets where we can, get information, but there is very little space left for the creativity. So you see that most of our time we are on smartphone, and smartphone always gives you, okay, it gives you a lot of information, updates, WhatsApp notification, this and that. There is very little where you can actually provide data, where you can actually, express yourself. There is very, very little scope for that. But when you go in the field, you start exploring, you start, looking around you, and you start making connections. You start, basically making inferences, which is an ability which we have and which we should nourish, which is not happening if you are stuck with a screen. Okay, so I think that is where the whole idea of the citizen science becomes very important for, especially for students and teachers. And in fact, I had done some workshops with some classes, some schools, where I got really good response with students. So students have so many things to tell. It's just that I think they don't really find the good, the good connection where they can display all this information. So when I recently had a interaction with some students, I showed them dragonflies around the wetland, just near their school. they got me a lot more interested in all the dragonfly species, and they started telling me about that there is this particular bird that comes to their house, or all these new things that they started um, sort of sharing with me, which was a really nice experience. So students do learn a lot when they go out in the nature. Uh, so here is this one particular slide which I was talking about earlier about informatics. So we collect a lot of biodiversity information, but how this information is actually utilized. This is something called biodiversity informatics, where a lot of information is gathered at one place, and then eventually this data is used in various ways to do research, or create opportunities for people to engage with the data. So right now I'm dealing with such data, Dragonfly data, and here are some of the students. All these students are third year computer engineering students, and they are working with me on the biodiversity data to create a pipeline for analyzing this data. So what they do is they extract data from Facebook, and then we analyze this in something called Dragonfly Informatics. And we are also designing an artificial intelligence based app for dragonfly identification. So if you take a picture of a dragonfly in the field, then that app can tell you which species the dragonfly belongs to. Okay. So, and the third project that we are working on is designing an Odonata listing app. So suppose if you go to an area and if you see multiple species of dragonflies, then in that particular app, you can record all the species of dragonflies, and you can record about the habitat quality. Also, there is a questionnaire in it, and you submit it. So it goes to a server, and it gets dumped there as a data. So suppose tomorrow, if a researcher wants to analyze, can simply download the data and analyze, and come up with new analysis that can help the conservation. So all I want to say is that I am not really working in the field of biological sciences. Okay, and science do not really have any boundaries. So all the different fields are sort of they are immersed together, and I think that is what we should teach our students, that don't look for medical or don't look for a career in engineering. There is all these are stereotypes which we ourselves have created because it's comfortable. I mean, it's very easy to say that you're an engineer, you're a doctor. Okay, it's easy to label people like that and categorize them, and that's how how we perceive the whole world. I mean, we always categorize things because categorization makes it easy for us to call it names or understand it better. But we have to understand that science is actually it's an interdisciplinary, although exist, but they have very fuzzy boundaries. So even if I am a ecologist or evolutionary biologist, I try not to say that. I try to say myself that as I'm a researcher, and when I say researcher, then I'm open to many new ideas which I can incorporate in my projects. So this was just to show you that things are working in this particular fashion. These students, although they are from computer science or computer engineering background, they were fascinated by dragonflies, and they came to me and they said that, sir, we want to do something in which we can use our knowledge and also help the society. So that's how we designed this project. So definitely there is a lot many options available for students today, and even the young faculty, the new generation is coming up with very holistic idea about education in general. So apart from dragonflies, we also have various citizen science portals. One is about owls, where people post data on owls. Another is on roadkills, where people post data on roadkills. Now this data is very important because wildlife is crossing the road many times, and they get killed as a road accident because of a fast moving vehicle. And this basically tells you roads as a barrier. If you are finding out that, okay, tomorrow in Melghat Tiger Reserve, they are going to, create a railway line, which was opposed a lot by the many environmentalists. And why they should oppose this? Because of such factors, because of such accidents which may happen. If a artificial line crosses a protected area, then many species may simply die off because they are not aware of fast moving vehicles, or they may not cope up with such a change. And we are talking about direct violation of wildlife protection here. So such such networks or such data can definitely help us in conservation. Now here is a nice graphics provided by eBird, which is another citizen science portal, and they collect data about birds. This is managed by Cornell Lab of Ornithology, and in this visualization you can see migration of 118 different bird species. So each dot represents one species, and you can see over the period of time how in the month of winter they move towards south, and in the month of in the summer they basically move northwards. So this is a migration which is completely based on citizen science collected data. So this is not the data that researchers went and collected. This is people like you who deposited data, and there are millions of such data points which were compiled together, and such an analysis has been created. So it gives you a clear indication that birds migrate, and they migrate in a certain fashion, and not all the species migrate to the largest extent. Some species locally migrate, some species migrate to the long distance. So based on these data, we can create lot many informative decisions which will really help us conserve the biodiversity and the landscape. So from my study on owls and the citizen science data together, I created the past suitable areas for the different species of owls that I worked on. So I basically created their suitable areas in the current scenario. So all these maps you can see, the red areas are the suitable areas for them. And I also did use the same data to go back in time, 6,000 years back, 22,000 years back, and 1,40,000 years back, and I reconstructed their suitable climatic areas. So in the case of forest owlet, I began with saying that this is an endangered species, and we don't really know what are the reasons why it is endangered. So one of the reasons came out to be the changes in climate that happened. So if you see around 1,40,000 years back, we predicted that the species was quite widespread in India. And around 22,000 years back, it shrunk in the spread. Again, in 6,000 years back, it's got widespread, but the extent was much lower than previously. And in the today's time, it is highly restricted only in Gujarat, Maharashtra, and Madhya Pradesh. So this has happened because all these time periods show that the climate had changed. Around 1,40,000 years back, there was warmer climate, and everywhere there were forest tracts. Around 22,000 years back, and there was very low temperatures everywhere. The sea level has most of the water was shrunk in ice, and the sea level had decreased. There was a lot of aridity, and many forests died off, and they were converted to grasslands. Okay. So perhaps that really affected the forest owlet, and it got restricted to only certain patches. And then eventually there was warming up. But once the species becomes restricted, then it is very difficult for the species to expand again. And perhaps that is the reason why we are seeing it is narrowly distributed in certain areas. So what I can definitely say that climate is a major factor that affects forest owlet, but not other species. In case of other species, you can see that spotted owlet has grown, there is not much effect that you can see in all the 4 maps. In case of jungle owlet, it was very, earlier it was, present in a very minute amounts, but over the years it has expanded. So in case of these 3 species, which are that's why it is restricted today. So if you're talking about climate change, then perhaps forest owlet's conservation is directly linked to the climate change. So if we conserve the forest owlet, we conserve the forest, and in a way we contribute to mitigating climate change, which basically helps us. So everything is sort of linked, and all the citizen science data that we collect can be analyzed in various ways to understand the processes. So I told you that there is I'm going to show you the pictures of the village in which I grew up and all my school days were spent. So this is the same route I used to take to my school, and I used to walk meters down the hill every day to reach to my school. So my schooling happened in this small tiny village called Pofri, and this is beautiful. And this is how the my village looks like during monsoon. So you can imagine that what kind of environment I grew up, and what all species of birds and amphibians and whatnot I heard and saw in my school days. And I think that is what inspired my whole career trajectory, and that's why I'm talking to you today. So the school education, especially a connect with the nature, can have a great influence on the personality of people, and it can really help you understand your priorities and what you want to do in the future. In fact, most of the ecologists today, they had a wonderful childhood. They had been in the laps of the nature when they were growing, especially during their school days. This is when I talk to many of them. They do refer that their school days were spent in the laps of the nature, and that's from where they got the inspiration. In fact, if you read the biography of Salim Ali, you will find the similar pattern, and for many other great personalities too. So nature education is definitely an important tool to connect people or the students to the nature, and also collect essential data which can definitely help in conservation. And yes, curiosity is a very important factor. So if a person is not really curious what happens around him or her, then I guess there is no point connecting that person to the nature. But as soon as you talk a little bit interesting stuff about nature, then there is this basic instinct within us, because we are all animals, and I think we always want to know more about nature, or how this works, how this insect flies. There is a curious mind that we all have. So I guess that is the end of my session, and I'll be happy to take any questions if you have. Okay. Okay. I think, yeah. Yeah, sure. So I'll be more than happy to connect with many schools and conduct sessions whenever the lockdown opens and we are all normal again. I'll be really happy to come to your school and give a talk, and connect students with the nature. Perhaps we can do a nature trail or something like that. In fact, we are writing a project on the lines of creating creating a network of schools, okay, where students can exchange their citizen science data, and they get connected because of a similar interest. So this is something that we are making. It's in the pipeline, but if it is successful, then I can definitely talk to you about it. Okay, so so there is a question about the name of the app. So we are still in the process of making the app. It is still not ready. So we are still testing it, but perhaps soon it will be launched.
With your graph, we identified that forest owl is in endangered species now.
Yes.
Are we taking any step to recover it, like Save the Tiger is a project announced by India in government, and now the number has increased. Like that, why don't we start some project to save, to protect the forest wall?
Yes. So yeah, there are recommendations provided to the forest department, and in some places, there is a group who is doing monitoring of the forest outlet. So they have fitted cameras on the nest, on the cavities where the forest owlet nests, to check what kind of threat forest owlets have and why do they, why do they not survive in the wild. So that study is happening, and many nests are under protection. So many nests are on legal protection, where the forest guards, they patrol and they see whether the nest is okay or not. So that kind of activity we are engaging in, but still there is a lot of information we still do not have. For example, what exactly is the geographical distribution, in which all areas they are found, and all that. So there is a lot of research which still need to be conducted to come up with the right strategy. But wherever there are owls, we are doing that. So I'm sharing the link to my lab website. You can check it out, and you can go and see what are different projects we are doing, and how different people are involved in this. So it's not only about academicians or researchers, but people from various backgrounds, they are coming together and working together. Okay. Well, yeah, I mean, when I was working in Arunachal Pradesh, basically we were heading towards creating an ecotourism initiative, which was basically tribal people coming together and they participate in such activities so that they get finance and local livelihoods. So Northeast is quite famous for hunting, and the tribal, they are basically hunters, and I mean, it's the tradition that they keep on hunting, and that's a big problem in Northeast if you think of the biodiversity it has. So when we were working in Arunachal Pradesh, we basically, I mean, I was not directly involved in this, but Dr. Ramana Atreya created a very nice economic model in which he stopped hunting in that particular Eagle Nest Wildlife Sanctuary completely. And there is this tribe called Bugun tribe. So he involved the tribe members in protection of the biodiversity and creating an ecotourism initiative. So now if you go to Eagle Nest, you will, if you want to explore Eagle Nest, if you want to know all the bird species and all the animal species in the Eagle Nest, you may want to hire a guide. Okay. Now this guide is most likely a Bugun person. So they have created this venture in which you will definitely go to a Bugun person. The Bugun person will take you to the field and he will show you all the species. Okay, without using call playbacks, without using any invasive methods. And you will definitely, be staying there. So all the accommodation will be provided by Bugun people. Food is provided by Bugun people. Guidance is provided by them. The travel, logistic, everything is, set by them. So they get a lot of money by tourism activities, and they don't need to kill birds for, their livelihoods. So this is one way by which the communities get involved in the protection of the wildlife, and they also get, incentives in terms of money. In case of Andamans, where I worked, there was also many tribal people and also Indians, the settled Indians, who are almost like tribals, because they are really sort of behind the technology that's happening in India. So they're almost 10-15 years behind us, and they do a lot of hunting, and they also extract a lot many natural resources for their own benefit. But the project I was working in, we basically had tribal people involved in the protection of birds, and they were getting paid for it. They were getting a salary, fixed salary, and there was no need for them to kill the birds anymore because they were getting a salary. They could simply go and buy chicken and eat it if they really want bird meat to eat. So there are all these initiatives. There are many various ways by which people can get involved in livelihoods, making their livelihoods better. So they don't really need to depend a lot on the natural resources. Yeah, sure, definitely. You can write to me. Yeah. Yes. Yes. Thank you, Habib, for the opportunity. Okay. So thank you everyone for joining. It was nice interacting with all of you.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye.
Yes.